Behind the Mountains of Shadow and the Ash Mountains lay the infamous land of Mordor, a dark and desolate land that was the home of many evil creatures. Stories of the horrors that lived there would even trouble peaceful and far-off lands such as the Shire and Bree, and the very mention of Mordor would bring about an uneasy feeling. Hey guys, it's Carl here, and in today's episode, we'll be exploring the history of Mordor, the Land of Shadow. So it almost seems like Mordor was destined to become a fortress of evil, and the very first seeds of corruption in this land would be spread there by Sauron's master called Morgoth. For Morgoth wanted to infuse the lands of Middle-earth with his malice and corruption, which left them in a weakened state. And one of these wounds was the volcano called Rodruin, which would one day be known as Mount Doom. The foul fumes and smoke of this volcano spread across the land and covered it in darkness, which is why the elves called it Mordor, meaning the Land of Shadow or the Black Land. The first evil creature to settle in this land was Shelob, the Great Spider, for she had fled to Mordor after the War of Wrath and the ruin of Beleriand at the end of the First Age, and the Mountains of Shadow were soon filled with her children. This land offered her some peace and safety, and for a time she would capture and feed upon the elves and men that crossed into her territory, though after Sauron's arrival, this food source ran dry, and she would usually have to feed upon orcs at best. Now around the year 1000 of the Second Age, the Númenórean power had grown to exponential levels, and Sauron began to worry and fear its strength. It was clear to him that he needed a land with formidable and natural defenses, far from the influence of Númenor, and Mordor was the perfect place for his plans. Its mountain ranges were an excellent and insurmountable defense, and the few entry points into this land could easily be fortified and defended. Even the fires of Mount Doom could be twisted to serve Sauron's purpose, for he wanted to use them in his sorceries and to act as fuel for his forges, and he started to gather and summon all of the old servants of his master, such as the orcs, trolls, and other evil creatures, and the land of Mordor protected them from sunlight, since it was covered in darkness thanks to the smoke of Mount Doom. The main entrance into Mordor was through a natural pass where the northern peaks of the Mountains of Shadow met with the western peaks of the Ash Mountains, and Sauron built the Black Gate across this passage to seal it off, and he began the construction of a great stronghold, the fortress of Barad-dûr. In the year 1600 of the Second Age, Sauron used the fires and magic of Mount Doom to forge the One Ring, and with this new creation, he could finally use the ring's power to complete his great fortress. Sauron now had a massive army at his command, stationed in Mordor, and he possessed a great artifact of power, and in the year 1695, he unleashed them upon Middle-earth, as he led his armies into the lands of Eriador, devastating them. For a while, Sauron's forces had the upper hand, and they drove the free people of Eriador to the brink of defeat. Yet his victory was snatched from his hands when a great Númenórean fleet came to the aid of their elven allies, and they turned the tide of this war. Sauron barely escaped alive to the land of Mordor, with only a handful of his forces left, and he now had a new foe to contend with. It was clear to him that the Númenórean influence had grown too strong, and that he couldn't move out of Mordor and attack Eriador while they remained in power, and so he chose to bide his time and use his influence to dominate and gather the Easterlings and Haradrim. He wanted to try and bait the Númenóreans into attacking his stronghold in Mordor, for his defenses might shift the battle in his favor, and so he began to raid the Númenórean settlements in Middle-earth, and he declared that he was the king of all men. These actions did not sit well with Ar-Pharazôn, the king of Númenor, and in the year 2261, a massive armada sailed out of the ports of Númenor to deal with Sauron's insolence. They were so great a power that Sauron feared that not even the mighty defenses of Mordor might be enough to hold them back, and he decided to humble himself before Ar-Pharazôn and ask for his pardon, which Ar-Pharazôn accepted, and Sauron was taken to Numenor, where he became part of their courts, and through his subtle manipulation, he corrupted the Númenóreans and orchestrated the fall of Numenor in a cataclysmic event that sunk their island beneath the sea. Not even Sauron would manage to escape unscathed from this destruction, for his body was destroyed, and his spirit fled back to Mordor and took refuge in his stronghold of Barad-dûr, where he secretly reformed his body in a new and terrible image of hatred and malice. Now, even though the threat of Numenor was wiped out, Sauron's victory wasn't as complete as he hoped, for a few of the Númenóreans that were led by Elendil had survived and escaped to Middle-earth, where they established the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor, and they knew that Sauron, their ancient enemy, had survived and was recovering in Mordor, for they saw smoke rising out of Orodruin, and due to this ominous sign, they called this volcano Mount Doom, or Amon Amart in Elvish. Now beneath the darkness of Mordor, Sauron had started to gather his armies once more, orcs, trolls, and men from the eastern and southern lands, and he also managed to recruit some evil Númenóreans that had settled near the southern coast of Middle-earth. He would use these forces to conquer Minas Ithil, and it soon became clear to the Free People that unless they united, they would eventually fall one by one to Sauron's growing power, and so they formed the last alliance of elves and men in the year 3434 of the Second Age, and they marched towards the Black Gate of Mordor, where they fought a terrible battle upon the plains of Dagorlad. The ferocity of the orcs was no match for the valor of the Free People, and they managed to breach the Black Gate and push through into the lands of Mordor, where they laid siege to Sauron's fortress of Barad-dûr. For 7 long years, the siege was maintained, while the Free People suffered grievous losses from the constant barrage of arrows, rocks, and fire, though their persistence would eventually pay off, and Sauron's situation began to look so dire that he descended from the safety of his stronghold and fought Gil-galad and Elendil upon the very slopes of Mount Doom in a duel that would claim all of their lives. Now, while the One Ring persisted, Sauron would be able to reform and recover his strength, even though his body was destroyed, though his armies were now left leaderless and divided. Some of the men in his service chose to surrender and become subjects of Gondor, while others chose to follow the Nazgûl and flee to the eastern lands, and some even decided to remain and hide in the land of Mordor. The forces of the West would go on to destroy most of the stronghold of Barad-dûr, though its foundations were indestructible since they were built using the power of the One Ring, and Mordor would lie desolate for the most part. Yet the horror and memory of Sauron remained like a shadow over this land, and the dread of Mount Doom was ever present, and none of the Free People dared to live there. There was also the chance that Sauron would try to return to Mordor and pick up his mantle of Dark Lord once more, and so Gondor set up a guard to watch over this land, which also served to prevent any of Sauron's servants and creatures from escaping Mordor and troubling the Free People. Some of these fortifications were the Watchtower of Cirith Ungol, the Fortress of Durtang, and the 2 towers that were built on either side of the Black Gate, called Narcost and Carcost. For over 1,000 years, a vigilant watch was kept over Mordor, though as is often the case with men, it slowly began to grow complacent and neglected in the year 1100 of the Third Age, as the strength of Gondor waned. By the year 1636, it would cease completely, after a great plague swept across the land of Gondor, killing many of its people, and they would lack the manpower to maintain these fortresses, and the watch was abandoned. Many of Sauron's evil creatures and servants would start to slowly creep back into Mordor, and the worst of these were the Nazgûl, who began to prepare Mordor for Sauron's return. Their first move was to conquer the Gondorian fortress of Minas Ithil, which was close to their borders, And in the year 2000, the Witch King led an army through the abandoned pass of Cirith Ungol under the cover of night, and they laid siege to Minas Ithil, which fell to their forces after 2 years. Under the Witch King's rule, it became a corrupted and twisted place, and through it, the Witch King launched many attacks upon Gondor, and Osgiliath became a permanent battlefield. In the year 2475, a new race of orc would appear in Mordor, which was stronger and more resilient, the Black Uruk-hai. And with these improved forces, the Nazgul were able to conquer the lands of Ithilien and Osgiliath, though they weren't able to hold them for more than a few years. Now throughout all of this time, the Nazgul were simply acting as a proxy for Sauron, who was disguised as the Necromancer of Dol Guldur, and Sauron would finally return to Mordor in the year 2941, after the White Council drove him out of his stronghold. For the next 10 years, he would lie low and rebuild his fortress of Barad-dûr, filling it with armories, dungeons, furnaces of war, and strong gates made out of steel and adamant. And once it was completed, he finally declared his return. The Palantir of Minas Morgul was brought to Sauron and kept in Barad-dûr, and Barad-dûr was now the greatest fortress ever seen since the fall of Morgoth. Sauron would often stay in its topmost tower, looking through its window at distant lands as he pushed forth his will, and he would use his magic to weave veils of shadow that would spread out across his land from Barad-dûr. Sauron also filled the abandoned fortifications of Gondor, such as Cirith Ungol and the Towers of the Teeth, with his servants, and he repaired and strengthened them, and all of the entrances into his realm were now secure and seemingly impregnable. Shelob also played a part in his defense, for she helped to secure the pass of Cirith Ungol, and Sauron would sometimes feed her by sending prisoners into her cave that had outlived their usefulness. With all the armies Sauron was gathering in Mordor, a good and reliable food supply was necessary, and the southern lands of Mordor that were close to the Lake Nurnen were filled with great fields that were worked by slaves. The Easterlings and Haradrim would also bring long wagon trains filled with food, and at times they would also carry fresh slaves to replace those that perished. Now Mordor's strength was growing by the day, for Sauron was using his power to summon all the wicked and evil creatures to this land, and he even managed to breed a new race of troll called the Olog-hai that were stronger and more agile, and they were even resistant to sunlight, and they could only speak in the black speech of Barad-dûr. One of these creatures that heard Sauron's call was Gollum, and he slowly made his way towards Mordor, where he met Shelob in the year 2980, and he would live in the dark hills of this land for a while, until he was captured by Sauron's forces in the year 2009. Gollum was then taken to the fortress of Barad-dûr, where he was tortured for information for 9 long years, and he gave up the names of the Shire and Baggins. And after Sauron realized that his forces had extracted as much information as they could from Gollum, he ordered them to release him and allow him to flee through the pass of Cirith Ungol, for he hoped that Gollum might lead his forces to the Shire. Towards the end of the Third Age, the reach of Mordor had grown tremendously, and the orcs would raid and pillage the eastern lands of Rohan to steal their horses for the servants of Sauron. And during the War of the Ring, the Nazgul would often use their Felbeasts to fly over the land surrounding Mordor to scout for any possible intruders. Now during the siege of Gondor, the army of Mordor was the greatest host to ever emerge from this land, and the vast majority of Sauron's forces passed through Minas Morgul to attack Minas Tirith, though another smaller force was sent through the Black Gate to attack the island of Carandros. Sauron would use the fumes and smoke of Mount Doom and send them towards the land of Gondor to ease the passage of his orcs and spare them from the sunlight. Though as the battle turned in Gondor's favor, these clouds of darkness were swept aside, and some light even managed to pierce through the dark canopies of Mordor. Since they managed to repel the armies of Mordor, it was now time for the forces of the West to take the battle to Sauron and attack the Black Gate, for they hoped to distract him and keep his eye focused on the north, while Frodo journeyed through the western pass of Cir Ungol. It had not occurred to Sauron that the host of the West was planning to deceive him, and he emptied his lands and assembled all of his armies next to the Black Gate, and this mistake allowed Frodo and Sam to safely reach Mount Doom and destroy the One Ring. With the ring's destruction, everything that had been built or created with its magic was destroyed, and the stronghold of Barad-dûr crashed to the ground, and it's believed that the Palantir of Minas Ithil that was kept within this tower was destroyed after it was consumed by the fires of Mount Doom. With their master defeated, the armies of Sauron were left in despair and confusion, and many of the orcs were slain by the Free People, and some of the men that served Sauron chose to surrender, while others made a final stand. The host of the West would enter the land of Mordor to free the slaves of Nurn and to destroy the orc strongholds that were left in this land. And in the days to come, Aragorn proclaimed that the land of Nurn would be given to the freed slaves, and so perhaps a more wholesome future awaited the land of Mordor in the Fourth Age. Now, before ending this video, I'd like to mention two other brief points. Firstly, that Mount Doom seemed to become more active whenever Sauron's power was growing, and secondly, that the language of Mordor used to be an ancient form of the Black Speech, though after Sauron's defeat in the Battle of the Last Alliance, this language was forgotten by all of his servants apart from the Nazgûl, and the orcs would use a simplified version of it. Anyway friends, this wraps up today's video, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the land of Mordor. Do you think that it was ever healed and became similar to the rest of Middle-earth as time went by? And how do you think Barad-dûr compares to Angband and Utumno, the fortresses of Morgoth? As always, I'd like to thank my patrons who have really helped to elevate this channel. It wouldn't be the same without you, and I would like to express how grateful I am for your support, especially our Wizard tier patrons, T. Gorman, Mike Feeney, Roland Mervold, and Jacob Williams. If you too would like to help support this channel while unlocking some cool perks, I'll be leaving a link to my Patreon page in the video description below. I'll also be leaving links to our Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and Twitter communities, so follow us if you'd like to have some extra Lord of the Rings content in your day-to-day lives. As always, if you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe to join our fellowship today. I hope to see you all in my next video, where together we'll once again explore the magical world and lore of Middle-earth.